This is a true story shared on a forum dedicated to discussing Bigfoot in 2011. I wasn't planning to write about this, but after everything that happened, I feel like I have to. Maybe someone else has experienced the same thing. Maybe someone can explain what I saw out there. I've been hiking solo for years, mostly in the Rockies. I like the solitude. No distractions. No people. Just me in the wilderness. I've never had any problems before. No injuries, no close calls with wildlife. Nothing that ever made me feel unsafe, until this trip. I started my hike on the first weekend of October, a 5-day trek through a remote section of the mountains. The trail was lightly traveled, but I didn't mind. The fewer people, the better. I had my gear, my food, my maps, and my satellite communicator in case of emergencies. Everything was going according to plan. The first day was perfect. Cool air, clear skies, and the smell of pine all around me. I made it to my first campsite by a small river and set up my tent. As the sun went down, I sat by my fire, eating my freeze-dried meal and enjoying the silence. But then I heard something. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. A rhythmic, thumping sound. At first, I thought it might be a woodpecker, but it was too deep, too heavy. It sounded like someone was hitting a tree with a log. 3 knocks. Then silence. A few minutes later, 3 more knocks. I'd heard of bears scratching trees and elk rubbing their antlers, but this didn't sound like that. It was deliberate. Intentional. I sat there, listening, but after a while, it stopped. The woods went quiet again, and I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a tree shifting in the wind. I went to sleep that night without any issues, but looking back, I wish I had turned around right then, because that was just the beginning. I woke up early the next morning, feeling well rested. The forest was quiet, except for the usual morning sounds, birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant flow of the river. I packed up my camp, ate a quick breakfast, and started hiking again. The trail was beautiful. Autumn had started to settle in, and the trees were turning shades of orange and red. I didn't see a single person the entire morning, which was fine by me. I liked the solitude. But as I moved deeper into the mountains, I started getting this weird feeling. At first, I couldn't place it. It wasn't fear exactly, just discomfort. Like something was just off. The air felt heavier. The silence seemed deeper. And every now and then, I got the distinct sensation that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a bear or a mountain lion, but there was nothing, just trees. A few hours later, I took a break on a ridge to drink some water and check my map. That's when I saw it. Down in the valley below, maybe 100 yards away, was a cluster of trees. One of them looked wrong. It had been stripped of its bark, the wood underneath clawed and splintered like something had raked massive hands down it. I'd seen trees damaged by animals before. Bears will scratch to mark territory, elk will rub their antlers. But this was different. The marks were too high, too deep. It almost looked like someone had taken a massive tool and carved into the wood. Then I noticed something even stranger. At the base of the tree, half hidden by leaves, was a large round shape. At first, I thought it was a boulder, but as I stared at it, I realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was a footprint, a huge footprint, bigger than any human foot, too wide, too long. The edges were slightly blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe an old bear track that had been warped by the elements. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me. I forced myself to keep going. But as I left the ridge and continued deeper into the mountains, that feeling of being watched never went away. And by nightfall, it would only get worse. By late afternoon, I found a decent spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick pines. The place felt a little closed in, but I was tired from hiking all day, and I didn't want to push further as the sun started dipping lower. As I unpacked my gear, that uneasy feeling still lingered. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sounds, just the usual stillness of the deep woods. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Spending too much time alone can mess with your head. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. As the flames crackled, I started to feel a little better. Fire has a way of making you feel safer, even when you know it wouldn't do much if something really wanted to get you. After eating, I sat by the fire and tried to relax. The stars were coming out, the air was crisp, and for a while, it actually felt peaceful. Then I heard it again. Knock, 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 that same rhythmic, heavy sound from the night before. It was coming from somewhere beyond my camp, deeper in the woods. I froze, listening. A few minutes passed. Then, 3 more knocks. This time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees, but I couldn't see anything past the first few trunks. The beam barely penetrated the thick darkness beyond the firelight. Then, from the opposite direction behind me, another knock. I spun around, my heart pounding. Was it echoing? Was there more than one source? I swallowed hard and forced myself to think logically. Maybe it was just a tree settling or something shifting in the cold air. Maybe it was an animal. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Because at that moment, the forest felt different. Not empty, not silent, occupied. Something was out there, and it was letting me know. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. My breath was slow and measured, but my heart was hammering in my chest. The knocks had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. I scanned the tree line, moving the flashlight in slow, deliberate arcs. The dense forest swallowed most of the light, revealing nothing but the rough bark of tree trunks and tangled undergrowth. Then, as I swept the beam to my left, I saw them. Eyes. 2 pale yellowish reflections, just beyond the reach of my firelight. They were high, too high for a deer, too far apart for a bear. And they weren't moving. I held my breath, staring. My mind raced through possibilities. A trick of the light? An owl? Some kind of reflection off the damp leaves? Then they blinked. I felt a rush of cold fear flood my body. Whatever it was watching me, and it knew that I had seen it. I slowly reached for my bear spray, never taking my eyes off the spot where the reflections had been. My hand fumbled over my pack, fingers shaking. When I looked back, they were gone. The undergrowth rustled. A branch snapped. Something big was moving through the trees. I shot my flashlight in that direction, but I saw nothing. Just the deep, suffocating blackness of the forest beyond my camp. My instincts screamed at me to run, to pack up my gear and get the hell out of there. But it was already dark. Hiking through uneven terrain at night was a recipe for disaster. I forced myself to stay put, trying to think rationally. If it was a bear, I needed to make noise, let it know I wasn't prey. I took a deep breath and called out, "Hey! Get out of here!" The forest swallowed my voice. No movement, no response, just silence. I wasn't sure which was worse, the sound of something moving out there or the sudden stillness that followed. I stared into the trees for what felt like an eternity, waiting for another sign of whatever was out there. Nothing came. Eventually, I forced myself to crawl into my tent, bear spray at my side. I kept the flashlight on, aimed toward the entrance. I barely slept that night. Every little sound outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. And even though I never heard the knocks again, that feeling never left. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever was watching me wasn't done yet. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound. Footsteps. Not the distant, scattered movements of an animal rustling through the underbrush. These were slow, deliberate, heavy. They crunched through the fallen leaves just outside my tent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, the wind shifting branches, or maybe a deer wandering too close. But deep down, I knew better. I clenched my bear spray and strained to listen. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and methodical, moving from one side to the other. It was walking on 2 legs. No doubt about it, a sick feeling settled in my stomach. I'd spent enough time in the wild to know how animals move. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It was something else. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. My flashlight was still on, aimed at the thin fabric of my tent wall. If anything came closer, its shadow would show. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then something brushed against the tent. A light, dragging motion, like fingers trailing along the fabric. I almost lost it right then. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to tear out of that tent and sprint into the night. But I knew that was suicide. Running blind in the dark, alone in unfamiliar terrain? No way. So I did the only thing I could. I slowly reached up and pressed my hand against the tent wall where the touch had been. Nothing. Just fabric. Just empty air. Had I imagined it? Then, directly above me, A deep exhale. Right on the other side of the tent, a slow, deliberate breath. Something huge standing just inches away, breathing down at me. My blood turned to ice. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to make a sound. My fingers tightened around the bear spray. If it ripped through the tent, I'd go down fighting. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The footsteps moved away, slow at first, then faster, disappearing into the trees. Silence returned. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light finally filtered through the fabric of my tent, I unzipped the door with trembling hands and stepped outside. The ground around my tent was covered in massive footprints. Barefoot, human-like, but far too big. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. Something had been there, and it had been watching me all night. The moment I saw the footprints, my stomach dropped. They weren't just big. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, and far wider. I crouched down to get a closer look. The depth of the impressions meant whatever had made them was heavy. I touched one of the prints, pressing my fingers into the dirt. The edges were sharp, fresh. It had been here only hours ago. I looked around, scanning the tree line. The forest was eerily still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that same oppressive silence I'd felt the night before. Something told me I had overstayed my welcome. I needed to leave. Now. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. Every few seconds, I would glance up, expecting to see something watching me from the trees. But the forest remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I slung my pack over my shoulders, gripped my bear spray tightly, and started walking. I was supposed to be out here for another 2 days, but there was no way in hell I was staying. I had a GPS, and I knew I could reach my truck by late afternoon if I moved fast. So I picked up the pace. The first few miles were uneventful. I tried to keep myself calm, repeating logical explanations in my head. Maybe it was just some kind of trick of the light. Maybe the footprints weren't as big as they looked. Maybe the footsteps outside my tent had been a bear, and I had let my imagination run wild. But then, about an hour into my hike, I saw something that shattered any doubt I had left. Up ahead, in the middle of the trail, a tree had been torn out of the ground and placed across the path. Not fallen, placed. The trunk was stripped of branches, lying perfectly perpendicular to the trail, as if something had deliberately set it there. And on the side of the tree facing me, there were 3 deep claw marks running parallel down the bark. I stopped cold, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't natural. This was a message. And I wasn't sure if it meant stay out or don't leave. I swallowed hard and made my decision. I was getting out of these woods. Now. I climbed over the fallen tree as quickly as I could, my breath coming faster now. I didn't care if I scraped my hands or tripped. I just needed to keep moving. The moment my boots hit the ground on the other side, I took off at a brisk pace, resisting the urge to run. Running would be a mistake. Running would make me look like prey. But my instincts were screaming at me, "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The forest felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, I saw it. A shadow. I had been keeping my eyes on the trail, but something in my peripheral vision made me stop dead in my tracks. About 50 yards to my right, standing between the trees, was a figure. Tall, broad, motionless. I didn't look directly at it. Not at first. I kept my head slightly turned, pretending I hadn't noticed. But I could feel it there. I shifted my eyes slightly, just enough to get a better look. The figure was half hidden behind a thick pine tree, only part of its upper body visible. But even from where I stood, I could tell it was huge, easily over 7 feet tall. And it was just standing there, watching me. My mouth went dry. Every instinct told me to bolt, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I ran, it would chase me. I took a slow breath, steadied my grip on the bear spray, and kept walking. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I didn't look at it again. I didn't acknowledge it. I just kept moving. With every step, I expected to hear heavy footfalls behind me, expected to feel something crashing through the brush, but nothing happened. The oppressive silence remained. After a few minutes, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone. I exhaled sharply, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Had I imagined it? Had it actually been there? No, I knew what I saw, and whatever it was letting me go. For now. I turned back toward the trail and kept moving. I wasn't stopping again until I was out of these woods. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to panic. My body was begging me to run, but I knew that would be the worst possible move. I just had to get back to my truck. Another hour passed. The sun was lowering, but I was making good progress. My GPS told me I was less than 4 miles from the trailhead. Almost there. Then I heard it. A branch snapped. Not a small twig underfoot. This was loud. Something big. Close. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. The sound had come from somewhere behind me. I turned my head slightly, scanning the trees out of the corner of my eye. Nothing. Then, another crack. Closer this time. I knew I wasn't alone. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I started walking again. Faster now. I wasn't hiding it anymore. I needed to get out of here. But then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate, following me. I broke into a jog, gripping my bear spray so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps behind me quickened to match my pace. Then I made a mistake. I ran. The moment I did, it ran too. I heard it crashing through the underbrush, barreling through the trees with terrifying speed. It was fast, way too fast. I sprinted harder, dodging roots and low branches, barely keeping my footing. My pack bounced against my back, but I didn't dare stop to adjust it. The footsteps behind me weren't slowing down. Whatever was back there, it was chasing me. I was breathing hard now, my legs burning, my heart hammering in my chest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A clearing. The last stretch of the trail before the parking lot. I was so close. I pushed myself harder, lungs screaming, legs aching. The moment I broke into the open, the footsteps behind me stopped. Just like that, I kept running, didn't look back, not until I reached my truck. I fumbled for my keys, nearly dropping them as I yanked open the door. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Only then did I dare to look. The forest behind me was still, the tree line dark. Nothing moved, but I knew. Something was there. Watching, waiting. I didn't stick around to find out what. I started the engine and tore out of there, leaving a cloud of dust in my wake. I was safe. I had made it out, but I knew, deep down, it had let me go. And that terrified me more than anything. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that forest. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my mind replaying the chase over and over. What the hell had just happened? I pulled into a gas station off the highway, parked under the bright fluorescent lights, and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My legs were still shaking. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I felt like I had barely escaped with my life. And the worst part? I had no proof, no pictures, no video, just my word. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was just past 10 p.m. I debated calling someone, telling them what had happened, but what would I even say? Hey, I think I just got chased out of the woods by a giant creature that wasn't a bear? Yeah, no one would believe me. I decided to just go home, get some sleep. Maybe, with some distance, things would make more sense. But as I pulled out of the gas station, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. The back of my truck was covered in dirt, except for one spot. A smear right along the tailgate, like something had brushed against it. Or grabbed it. I swallowed hard and hit the gas. I didn't stop again until I was home. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those heavy footsteps, felt that thing chasing me. By morning, I decided I needed to go out and check my truck. I walked outside, the cool morning air doing little to settle my nerves. My truck was exactly where I had left it, parked in the driveway. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The smear was still there. It wasn't just dirt. It was something oily, something dark. And when I looked closer, I saw it wasn't just a random smudge. It was a handprint. A massive, 5-fingered handprint, larger than any human hand I had ever seen. I stumbled back, my pulse spiking all over again. This wasn't just some weird animal encounter. This thing had touched my truck. I stood there for a long time, staring at that mark, my mind racing. What had happened in those woods wasn't over. It had followed me. And somehow, deep down I knew, this wasn't the last time I'd see it. The handprint on my truck wouldn't leave my mind. No matter how much I tried to shake it off, the image was burned into my brain. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The size, the darkness, the fact that it had been on my truck. Whatever I had encountered wasn't just some animal. It was something other. That night, the nightmares started. At first, they were vague, a blur of shapes and shadows, but the one thing that was always the same was the feeling. The feeling of being hunted, of something always just behind me, following my every move. Then the dreams became clearer. I would be back in the woods, standing at the edge of that clearing where the tree had been felled. The sky would be dark, the air thick with tension, and in the distance I'd see the shadow again, that massive figure. It would always be just out of reach, always moving just enough to stay hidden. But I knew it was there, watching me. Every time I tried to run, I would trip, fall, and the thing would be right there, just a few feet away. Its heavy breathing the only sound I could hear. And then I would wake up, heart racing, drenched in sweat. Every time. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the stress. Maybe I was just imagining things after everything I had gone through. But it felt so real. I couldn't escape it. After a week of these relentless nightmares, I reached out to a local wildlife expert, hoping they could offer some kind of explanation. Maybe there had been a bear or some other large animal in the area that I had mistaken for something more sinister. I didn't want to mention the creature. I didn't want to sound crazy. The expert, a man named Jim, seemed interested but skeptical. He listened patiently as I described the situation, what I had seen, the footprints, the strange marks on my truck. "Well," he said after a long pause, "there are a lot of strange things that happen in the woods around here. But I've never heard of anything like what you're describing. Maybe you're dealing with something unusual. There are reports of strange sightings in these parts, but they're often chalked up to hoaxes or wild imagination. I wouldn't read too much into it unless there's something more concrete." I hung up the phone with a heavy heart. It was the same old story. No one believed you unless you had evidence, something more than just a shaky recollection of a terrifying experience. But I knew what I'd seen, and the nightmares only made it clearer. The creature was real, and it wasn't finished with me yet. It had been 2 weeks since the nightmarish encounter, and I was trying my best to move on with my life. I was back at work, focusing on anything other than what had happened in the woods. But the nagging feeling, the sensation that something was still watching, hadn't gone away. And then it happened. Late one evening, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was short, almost too simple. "I know you saw it." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. I hadn't told anyone else about what happened in the woods. I hadn't shared details with anyone besides Jim, the wildlife expert, and the people I had seen at the gas station. I didn't even recognize the number. Another message came a minute later. "You weren't the only one. Be careful." My fingers trembled as I typed a response. "Who is this?" The reply was almost immediate. "Someone who's been in your position, and you're not alone. It's still out there." I froze. I didn't know whether to be relieved that someone else had seen it, or terrified that this person might know far too much. I sat back in my chair, feeling the familiar chill creep up my spine. Whoever was texting me clearly knew more than they should. And it wasn't just some coincidence. They had to have seen something, too. I typed out a hesitant message. "What do you know?" The response came quickly again. "I've been tracking it for years. I've seen the same thing you have. But there's more. The creature in the woods isn't the only one. There are others, and they don't like being followed. Stay away from the forest. Don't go back." I didn't reply immediately. My mind was racing. My hands were sweating. Who was this person? What did they mean by others? I thought about the night in the woods, about the massive creature I had barely escaped. I thought about the handprint on my truck. And then I thought about the nightmares. They were getting worse. And now, someone else, someone I didn't know, was warning me about things I didn't understand. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but something told me I couldn't ignore this. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to go back to the forest, not immediately anyway. But I was going to find out who had sent that message. If they knew what I had seen, maybe they had answers. So, I started my search. I reached out to every contact I had, researchers, hikers, anyone who might have heard about strange encounters in the woods. I dug through forums, tracking down any mentions of creatures that matched the one I'd seen. I searched for anything that could explain the feeling of being hunted. Then, about a week later, I found something. A post from someone who had been active in the same forums I'd been browsing. They talked about an encounter near the same part of the forest where I had been. The details matched, and the post was eerily familiar. The author's name was John Baker. I decided to reach out to him. I sent a message asking if he had seen something strange in the woods. I didn't mention my encounter, didn't say anything about the text messages. Just a simple question. Have you seen anything unusual in the forest? The response came a few hours later. I've been waiting for you to ask. The response sat in my inbox for a long time before I could bring myself to open it. I've been waiting for you to ask. I stared at the message, my thoughts racing. Was this person the one who'd been texting me? How did they know I would contact them? Was it just coincidence, or was something far stranger happening? I clicked on the message and read it slowly, trying to make sense of the words. You don't know me, but I know you, or at least, I know what you saw. I've been tracking that creature for years. I've seen it too, and I've learned a lot about it since then, about what it is and why it's here. But I need you to understand something. You're not the only one. There are others who have seen it too. People who have come across it in the forest, and like you, they've left with more questions than answers. You're not alone. I felt my throat tighten as I read the message. It was like he knew everything. It felt like he was talking directly to me, like he'd somehow been in my head. The mention of others made my skin crawl. I was beginning to feel like I was caught in something far bigger than just one terrifying encounter. Meet me, the message continued. Meet me at the old diner off Highway 82 at 9 p.m. There's something you need to hear, something that could help you understand what's going on. But be careful. If the creature is watching you, it's already too late. I sat there, frozen, staring at the words on the screen. Was this a joke? Was I being pulled into some kind of elaborate hoax? But no, there was something in the message, the tone, the urgency, that made it feel real. I thought back to the text messages, to the warnings I'd received. Whoever this was, they knew something important, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my keys. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I was done pretending like everything was fine. I needed answers. I needed to know what was in those woods. I drove to the diner with a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was out of the way, a little rundown, like the kind of place you'd only visit if you had no other choice. The fluorescent lights buzzed as I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. I parked, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment, collecting my thoughts. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows near the entrance. It was a man, tall, wearing a weathered jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He stepped forward, and without a word, I knew it was him, John Baker. Come on in, he said, his voice low but steady. We have a lot to talk about. I followed him into the diner. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee and greasy food, the quiet hum of a few lone patrons in the background. I sat down across from him at a small booth. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with those sharp, calculating eyes. I couldn't help but ask, why did you reach out to me? How did you know what happened? He leaned back, taking his time before answering. I've been tracking that thing for years, he said, his voice quiet. I know exactly what it is, and I know how dangerous it can be. But I also know it's not just a monster. It's part of something bigger, something that's been here for a long time. And that thing in the woods? It's not the only one. There's more. A lot more. I felt my stomach twist. What do you mean, more? His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. There's a group of us, people who've seen it, who've been tracking it, studying it. We know how it behaves, we know where it lives, but the truth is, we don't have all the answers. We don't know how many of them there are, or what their purpose is. I was starting to get a sinking feeling in my chest. I'm not the only one, he continued. There are people who have seen it. People who've disappeared after seeing it. People who've gone into the woods and never come back. I sat there, frozen, as the weight of his words hit me. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of something much bigger, something far more terrifying. We've been trying to warn people, but not everyone listens. And the worst part? The worst part is that the thing you saw is getting bolder. It's not afraid anymore, and it's getting closer to where people live. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. Why didn't you warn me sooner? John stared at me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Because I had to make sure you were ready, he said. You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not. John's words hung in the air like a dense fog, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're part of this now, he had said. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry. What do you mean, part of this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John leaned in, his eyes sharp and serious. The creature you saw in the woods, it's not just a random animal or some freak occurrence. It's part of something that's been around much longer than any of us. There's a group, people like me, who've been tracking them. We've seen them. We've even documented them. But there's more to it. There's a pattern. I didn't know what to say. All of this, it's connected, John continued. The disappearances, the sightings, the attacks, those aren't accidents. It's all happening for a reason, and I'm trying to figure out what that reason is. I stared at him in disbelief. You're telling me there's more than one of these things? And people have disappeared? He nodded grimly. Yes. They're not just in the woods either. They've been seen near towns, around campsites, and in remote areas. I've talked to people who've come across them, people who've barely made it out alive. I felt a chill run through me. I thought back to the warning I had received in those cryptic messages, the one that told me the creature was still watching me. You said they're getting bolder, I said slowly, trying to piece it together. What does that mean? Are they becoming more dangerous? John exhaled sharply. Yes, they've always been dangerous, but now they're getting closer to human settlements. They're becoming more active, more aggressive, and it's only a matter of time before someone else disappears. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My encounter had been horrifying enough. The idea that there were more of these creatures out there, getting bolder, made the whole thing feel like a nightmare that was just beginning. But why now? I asked. Why are they showing up more frequently? Why are they coming closer to towns? John's eyes darkened as he spoke. That's what I don't know, but I've been trying to figure it out for years. There's something about these creatures, something that ties them together. They've been here for centuries, but now it's like they're being drawn to something. Maybe a change in the environment. Maybe something in the woods is calling to them. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. And you think this creature I saw, it's connected to all of this? John looked at me for a long moment before answering. I'm sure of it. You've seen it, haven't you? The way it moves, how it's built. It's not just an animal. It's something else entirely. I nodded slowly. I remembered the creature's sheer size, its unnatural speed. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, and it was like it had been hunting me. John leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming on the table. I can't explain everything right now, but I can tell you this. You're not alone. We've been tracking these creatures for a long time, but you've got to be careful. There are people who know about them, who are willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. I felt a lump form in my throat. Who would want to keep this a secret? John's expression darkened. There are people in power, people with interests in keeping things under wraps. If the truth got out, if people knew how dangerous these creatures really were, it would cause chaos. So they do what they can to control the narrative, to make sure no one looks too closely. I shivered. The idea that there was some shadowy force working behind the scenes made everything feel even more sinister. What happens now? I asked, my voice trembling. What do I do? John stood up slowly, pulling on his jacket. Now, you keep your eyes open. Stay alert, and whatever you do, don't go back into the woods. I nodded, my stomach in knots. But something about his words felt off. There was a hidden warning in his voice, a kind of urgency that didn't sit well with me. As John turned to leave, he paused by the door and looked back at me. There's one more thing you need to know, he said. The creature you saw, it's not just one. There are others like it, and they are getting closer. If you want to survive, you need to be ready, because they are not going to stop. With that, he walked out, leaving me alone in the diner, the weight of his words sinking in. I sat there for a long time, staring out the window into the dark night. I had thought I was done with the creature, but I was wrong. It was just beginning. The end of part 1.